It is now almost 1.5 years that we are in the midst of this horrible conflict, an act of military aggression of one European country against another European country, with results that are enormous. The destruction is beyond belief. The economic consequences are disastrous. The human suffering that is connected to this conflict is unbelievable. And also the international repercussions of this conflict are felt worldwide. It is thus not surprising that we are devoting a lot of thinking and a lot of talking to the various possibilities that are there, facilitating some kind of solution, facilitating some kind of understanding between the conflict partners, as difficult as this might seem at the moment. I'm very happy that I have as a partner in this conversation, Professor Charles Kupchan, senior fellow at the American Council of Foreign Relations, as well as professor for international relations at Georgetown University, prolific writer and very deep thinker about international problems, international conflicts. Charles, I'm very happy that you are here for this talk. And I would like to start our conversation by referring to a paper or to an article which you have published recently in Foreign Affairs, together with the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, Richard Haas, about the various possibilities that the West would have in engaging in a way trying to facilitate some kind of solution to this horrible, disastrous conflict. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about sort of your ideas and the thinking that went into that paper.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Eva. It's nice to see you again. It's good to be back with you and the Bruno Kreisky Forum. The article that I wrote with my colleague Richard Haas was really an effort to interject into the debate a stronger element of realism that I think has to some extent been lacking when it comes, at least to public debate between the United States and its allies, the NATO allies, and Ukraine. What's being said behind closed doors, I'm not sure, but I do think that the situation on the ground, the destruction that's being caused by the war, the degree to which the war is polarizing the international system, all of these factors give us reason to think about how to posture NATO and Ukraine after this coming offensive. And we lay out a strategy that has two phases in sequence. Phase one, do as much as we can to help Ukraine advance on the battlefield during this fighting season. And the offensive has already begun. We don't know how much progress the Ukrainians will make. My personal guess is that they'll make some progress, but that a full-scale victory defined as the liberation of all Ukrainian territory, including Crimea and all of Donbass, is unlikely. And I think under the best of circumstances, it's going to be a bloody summer. The Ukrainians, even with Leopard tanks, various high-end fighting vehicles, support from the United States and its European allies, they will be up against a very significant line of Russian defenses, minefields, trenches, tank traps, concrete fortifications. Ukrainian forces will need to come out into the open steppe of southern Ukraine to try to break through Russian defenses, and that will expose them to incoming artillery and fire and mortar fire and air power. And so this is going to be a very tough slog. And I do think that we have to ask the question, well, what do we do when we get to the fall, when we get to the end of this fighting season, and we have a new military stalemate, a new line? And that's really the beginning of what I would call phase two. And that is an effort to try to push Ukraine and Russia toward a ceasefire and a diplomatic effort to arrive at a more stable peace. I don't think that's going to be easy. Richard and I laid out in the article a set of incentives to try to push Ukraine as well as Russia toward a ceasefire and toward a negotiating table. But I do think that for the following several reasons, it makes sense to have that plan B ready to go if Ukraine is unsuccessful in achieving a decisive military victory. One, Ukraine is suffering enormous destruction. 35% plus of its GDP has been lost. Its cities are being attacked on a regular basis. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people killed on both sides. It's important for Ukraine to ask, is it better to take, let's say, the 88% of Ukraine that it possesses and rebuild and be secure and be headed toward membership in the European Union and integration into the West, or should they fight to the finish and risk the continued destruction of the country? Number two, I do think that this is a war that is causing enormous international instability. A Russo-Sino bloc is emerging. It is in a new Cold War of sorts with the West. Much of the rest of the world, including India, Brazil, Indonesia, that is to say, large developing countries, is not choosing sides. As a consequence, we're seeing instability radiating outward. Two final concerns that I think motivate us. One is the potential for escalation. This is a war that has the potential to turn into a wider war between Russia and NATO, with all the consequences that bear. And then finally, there is the issue of our own staying power. And to be very blunt about it, Eva, I'm worried about the political and economic trajectory of our own societies. The Republicans are in control of the House of Representatives. They may not be willing to give Biden everything he wants when it comes to assisting Ukraine. It's conceivable that the next president of France could come from the far right, Marine Le Pen. We need to pay attention to our domestic issues, even as we support Ukraine. And that's something that in the back of my mind would suggest that we need this plan B, because it's not clear to me for how long the level of assistance that we've been providing to Ukraine can be sustained.
Yeah, that's a very sobering analysis. At the moment, you are in a situation that both parties to the conflict, Ukraine as well as Russia, still believe in a military option. Yeah, while our experts and yours as well, and many international experts hold it for very unlikely that there will be a decisive military solution to this conflict. But as long as both parties are committed to the military option, yeah, it will be very difficult to get them to a negotiating table. We have seen that now with this sort of well-intentioned, but perhaps not quite well-prepared initiative of the American presidencies, of the African presidents, who were so humiliatingly rebuffed in the Kremlin, yeah, for their initiative of bringing both parties to a negotiating table. So it seems to me what has to happen is that you have a kind of a two-tier approach. Yeah, you have the one, you have to let them play out their game on the battlefield, but at the same time establish a kind of network around it where sort of diplomacy comes to its own, and you start talking again and bring various partners together. I think the two players, apart from sort of Europe, which of course is very strongly hit by this conflict, that have a special responsibilities, of course, the United States and China. And in that respect, I wonder if sort of the talks that Mr. Blinken has had now in Beijing, and the prospects also of some kind of meeting between President Xi and President Biden will have a bearing about on this situation. How do you see that?
Well, I would agree with you 100%, Eva, that right now there really isn't a moment for diplomacy. And that's because both the Ukrainian government and the Russian government is committed to keeping at it on the battlefield. The Ukrainians are going to give it their best shot, and they will fight hard in the coming months. Putin shows no signs of backing down. In fact, he continues to escalate. Now we hear he's transferring tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. Right? He may raise additional conscripts in the coming months because the Russians could lose a lot of soldiers on the battlefield. This could look a lot like World War I, with these two sides going after each other in a battle of attrition that takes many, many lives. So for now, there really isn't a window for diplomacy. But as you put it, behind the scenes, I think we do have to begin a process of planning for a diplomatic effort. And it may not work. It could be that neither Kyiv nor Moscow shows any interest in it, but at least we have to set the table for negotiations, even if in the end of the day, the two sides aren't prepared to sit at it. And I also think it's the case that even if the Russians are unprepared to call it a day, one could imagine a scenario where the Ukrainians have a pathway to the future. They may not get into NATO, but they may get security assurances and long-term military support that would enable them to defend themselves. And so maybe that plan B, even if it doesn't lead to a full-scale diplomatic endgame, does lead to a frozen conflict that ultimately enables most of Ukraine to rebuild and get on with life as a stable democracy integrated into the West. At this point, we don't know. And I would not, assuming that we get to that frozen conflict, give up on restoring Ukraine's territorial integrity. I just think it may be easier to achieve it at the negotiating table than on the battlefield, and less dangerous. And it's worth keeping in mind that patience paid off when it came to, let's say, the Baltic countries. We never recognized them as part of the Soviet Union, and now they are independent democracies and members of NATO. Maybe that same scenario will play out with Crimea. I agree with you also that the conversation that is taking place in Beijing between Tony Blinken, Xi Jinping, other top officials in China is a very good sign and an overdue step. The absence of strategic communication between the US and China and between the US and Russia is very dangerous. Military contacts have eroded. There has almost been no high-level dialogue among these key countries, and that I think is a mistake. I do think that if we are to get to an end game, it will take Chinese pressure. In the first instance, I think it will be the NATO addressing a diplomatic endgame and a ceasefire with Ukraine, ultimately discussing it with Moscow. I don't think that the Chinese are going to be the decisive mediator here, but nobody has more influence over Vladimir Putin than Xi Jinping. And that's because Russia is becoming day by day more and more dependent on China. So it may be that when we get to that critical moment and we have an opportunity to embark down the path of a ceasefire and diplomacy, Biden could pick up the phone, call Xi Jinping, and say, Mr. President, I need you to call Putin and tell him it's enough. That strikes me as a scenario that is not out of the realm of the possible.
I quite agree. I would say that quite apart from the Russian-Ukrainian conflict at the moment, it's a very encouraging sign that China and the United States begin talking to each other again. Yeah, that in itself is something which is extremely valuable that you establish here. Perhaps mutual trust is a little bit too much to say at the moment, but at least some base for dialogue and for creating a better understanding of mutual positions. I think that's in itself of a very high value. I would like to pick up something which you said about sort of the territorial issue, yeah, in the conflict. And there are so many solutions. If you look back on history, where models have been developed for solving a territorial question between countries that could be explored, and perhaps the know-how that is already there could be sort of collected, and ideas could be developed, what one could, how one could work around sort of this territorial issue of the Donbass and the Crimea. I would also like to pick up something which you said and which I think is very important. We must not lose sight of the domestic issues that are involved on our side in the West. Yeah, you have quite rightly said we don't know what is going to happen in various European countries at the moment. We don't know what is going to happen 2024 in the United States. We have so far managed in Europe to keep, in a way, the European countries together on a platform. Yeah, but the certain fissures and breaking lines are already there. Yeah, less on the question of the conflict itself, but for instance, the question how we deal with Russia. There are some countries that are more hesitant to get into a direct conflict situation with Russia. You have other countries that are very much formed by their own history. You've mentioned already the Baltic countries. It's quite clear that according to their history and the historical experience, they have an other approach to this issue than, for instance, countries that are firmly integrated into the Western European societies. But these are things that we must not, we must keep in mind. And this commitment that also President Biden always said, you know, as long as it takes, yeah, may be put in question by an incoming administration of a different view.
Those are all very insightful comments. You know, I think where you started off is very important, and that is, even though we are riveted by the war in Ukraine, it's really sucked up enormous amount of oxygen, of resources, of political capital. We can't lose sight of the broader international landscape. which is changing in profound ways. I mean, the rise of China it's a game changer. China will have the world's largest economy within a decade or so. China now holds sway in many parts of the developing world in ways that the Soviet Union never did. India will probably have the world's second largest economy by the second half of this century. India is carefully navigating. It's not going to clearly attach itself to the West, nor is it going to be part of some kind of Sino-Russian bloc. But we really have to understand the degree to which the global landscape is in the midst of a profound transition. And the war in Ukraine is making it much harder to manage that transition. And we can't afford to go back to global fracture because we've got climate change, we've got AI, we've got global health and pandemics. We need to find a way of having a conversation that leads to at least some level of cooperation across ideological dividing lines. And that's why one of the reasons I think this visit by Tony Blinken has been so important. I agree with you also that we need to think creatively about territory. I mean, let's take the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. The Ukrainians say it's ours, the Russians control it. Maybe we should turn it into a UN trusteeship and let the IAEA take it over for a while until this war settles down. Maybe we can find a way of putting Donbass and Crimea into some limbo that would allow the war to pause and for negotiations to begin. We're going to have to think about a creative way here because I think many people agree neither Russia nor Ukraine is going to achieve a decisive military victory. And then on the third issue, as I said, I'm worried. Having lived through the Trump era in Washington, D.C., I dealt, on a daily basis with the threat that illiberal populism poses to liberal democracy. And it's not over yet, right? It's the first or second chapter of a book with many chapters. And we cannot afford to lose sight of how important it is for us, for the liberal democracies, to get back up on our feet. And that is going to require a lot of creativity. This digital age, automation, AI, digitalization, this is all enormously disruptive to our societies and to how people put food on the table. And so we're at the beginning of a very bumpy and uncertain period. And I do think that the America First refrain of Donald Trump is not gone. And when you're a Republican or a Democrat for that matter, and you live in the American heartland where you're making, $12 an hour and trying to feed your family, it's at the top of your mind. Why are we spending, 100+ billions of dollars to defend Bakhmut or Sloviansk?
You find the same arguments in Europe.
Those are hard questions. And having been in Germany recently, I know a lot of German mayors in small towns who have been enormously generous with the resettlement of Ukrainian refugees. But I do think we have to ask, how long will that generosity last?
Yeah, well, we have a similar situation in Austria, of course, perhaps a bit on a smaller scale, but we've been very generous in sheltering Ukrainian refugees and sort of facilitating their integration also, into the labor market. We have made arrangements, for instance, for university students to continue their studies here at the universities without any problems and without too much bureaucracy and so on. So a lot of things have happened that show a humanitarian commitment also. Yeah. So far, this is being kept up, but there are no signs that this kind of generosity is waning. Yeah, people are sort of still holding strong. But I'm more worried about the political ramifications and the political side to it.
If I could just quickly add, I don't think that we should take lightly how solid the unity and the resolve has been across the Atlantic. If you and I had had this conversation, let's say a year ago, June 2022, and you said, will the coalition hold together for the coming year? I would have had my doubts.
Yeah.
But there really has been enormous leadership by Washington, by European capitals, and the support for Ukraine has been steady and been extremely impressive. And I think we need to put that out there.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and we can only hope that it will last. Yeah, in spite of possible political changes that we might expect. But I would like to touch on another issue, which you briefly mentioned. I mean, we have talked for some time already about the, how should I say, the sort of attack that is internationally being prepared or going on against so the system of worldwide governance that has been developed by the Western countries over the last 70 years, yeah, based on human rights, rule of law, liberal democracy, parliamentarism, and so forth. Where we have for long thought that this is really the system, yeah, for making the world a better place, and so and we felt, and I remember many conversations we had, that this system has been under attack, and that attack has been prepared carefully by a number of countries. And it seems to me that through this war, a kind of an acceleration has taken place, yeah, where all of a sudden these breaking lines that were there have become more pronounced, and the attack also on sort of what we would assume the West, yeah, under Marx, is much stronger at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this has been a sobering decade for those of us lucky enough to live in Western societies. And I do think that we made some mistakes back in the 1990s when the sense of, the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama put it, misled us about the durability and desirability and the ease with which we could universalize what we call the liberal international system. We tried to pull the Russians in. We opened the World Trade Organization to the Chinese, assuming that they would grow a middle class and they would liberalize. And we tried to bring in large chunks of the developing world, and it hasn't worked very well. And all the while, the West has also eroded from within, in part, in my mind, because we too readily embraced neoliberal orthodoxy. And we have seen many working Americans and working Brits and working Austrians and others suffer from globalization and suffer from automation. And as a consequence, our societies are today more polarized, and they are more bumpy when it comes to democratic governance than they used to be. And we've seen far-right movements of one sort or another grow in strength right across the Atlantic, both North America and Europe. And so I think this is now a moment for consolidation. We now need to spend less time and energy expanding the liberal order and more time and energy consolidating it from the inside out. get our democratic societies and our market economies back up on their feet. And then externally, I think we're headed toward a world of ideological diversity and political pluralism, not a world of the universalization of the Western order. And frankly, that's going to be hard for Americans to get used to, because kind of going back to the founding era, there has been this sense of American exceptionalism, America's messianic mission to bring democracy to the world. That may yet happen, but it's going to take a very long time. And in the meantime, those of us who live in Western democracies may need to learn to live in a world in which many parts of the world do not share our fundamental values when it comes to governance. But, and it's an important but, we're going to have to learn to live with them. Because if we don't, we're never going to tackle the big transnational problems of our time.
Yeah, I fully agree. It seems to me, however, that countries used at least to pay lip service. Yeah, I mean, human rights was never put in question openly. Yeah, rule of law was never put in question. Everybody tried to say we are following rule of law, we are try for democracy, and so at the moment this is no longer the case. And you have countries that are very outspoken and very publicly saying that this is not our value system. This is not something to which we subscribe. And I think that this is really a new kind of ball game that we have to play. And I quite agree with you that we have to come to terms with it, because if not, we are sort of moving on to very shaky grounds.
Yeah, I think we have to realize that this really is, it's a moment of decentralization, of deglobalization, of growing agency in many parts of the world that for a long time felt that they didn't have a voice. They didn't have a seat at the table. You know, if you just kind of look at what the economists are telling us about, you know, what's you know, we've lived in a world that really for the last 200 years has been dominated by Western democracies, really ever since the commercial and industrial revolution, right? First Pax Britannica, then Pax Americana. The leading economies of the world have been the US, Germany, Japan, Italy, Canada, the G7. Well, guess what? They're not going to be at the top anymore, right? And by 2050, 2060, the ranking in the world will be China #1, India #2, the US #3, Indonesia #4, right? Yeah. That's a whole new world. And I think that the ascent of countries in the global south will make this coming era much more multipolar than bipolar, even if there is US-China competition. And so for the first time in history, in my mind, we are going to have to figure out how to govern a world that is both globalized and interdependent, but also multipolar, with power decentralized in a way that we have not seen in several hundred years.
Yeah, I quite agree. Coming back to what you said a little bit earlier, China's role in this in this whole changing situation, where I'm by no means a China expert, yeah, not at all. But nevertheless, if you analyze everything that has been said and done, also at their party congress, the objectives that they have formulated for their own future, you would assume that China has a vested interest in some kind of stable international governance. Might be completely different concepts, underlying concepts, different values, and so. But but governance and order, some kind of international order, is, in my opinion, sort of central to Chinese interests. And I wonder if this is not an angle which one could approach also in the talks between the US and China, to bring them sort of to the table in working for some kind of international order.
Yes, I share that view. I think that it's one of the reasons that the partnership between China and Russia is going to be more fragile than meets the eye.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, if you go back to the 50s, the last time there was a partnership between China and the Soviet Union, it broke apart, in part because the Soviet Union wanted stability, and Mao and the Chinese, they wanted to overturn the world and revolution, and the peasants are coming. And Mao and Khrushchev parted ways. Well, now it's kind of the opposite. The Chinese have risen to being the #2 power in the world by taking advantage of global geoeconomic and geopolitical stability, right? They don't want chaos. I think Putin wants chaos.
That's exactly my point.
Right, because, you know, Russia is on the way down. Its demographic, economic picture is pretty bleak. His only game in town is to be a bad boy, a troublemaker, a spoiler. And the Chinese, I think, are in a very different place. They don't want to be in a world of Western hegemony. I don't think we know what they want to replace it, but I don't think that they want chaos. I think they want a more pluralistic order, but still an order that allows them to continue to enjoy a measure of geopolitical stability as well as economic growth. And so I agree that maybe down the road, the United States and China should be able to fashion some kind of agreement, guidelines, not just on managing their competition, but going beyond that. Let's cross our fingers and hope that Blinken's visit is the beginning of an effort to move in that direction.
And how do we bring Europe into the picture? Do you see the possibilities of European input in that endeavors?
I do. I mean, I think, number one, that Europe has risen to the occasion in response to the invasion of Ukraine. The readiness to sever economic, in particular energy dependence on Russia, was very impressive in my mind. Unity has been strong despite some differences of opinion. Germany is not, I would say, moving as fast as some would like, but it is reacquiring a geopolitical vocation, which is very difficult for Germany politically and psychologically. And so I think what we're witnessing here is really a testament to Europe's staying power. And I would also add that if one looks for signs of political health, Europe is in better shape than the Anglo-American world. Here and in the UK, the center really has been depopulated. Not so in some parts of Germany and in Europe. Germany in particular, the center has held. Is that going to be true forever? Who knows? But in many respects, the kind of political soul of the West right now is more centered in Europe than it is in the Anglo-American world, and that's very important. I don't think we're going to have a second Trump presidency, but if we do, Europe may again be the part of the world that holds down the liberal force.
Yeah. We'll see whatever happens. There is, of course, a big difference between our situation and the American situation, and that is whatever happens, Russia will be a neighbor of Europe. Yeah, And
Yes.
we will have, there will be life after Putin. We don't know what kind of form it's going to take. We don't know about sort of what kind of regime might emerge once Putin is gone. But Russia will stay, and geography is a factor here. And we have, of course, a vested interest to come to some kind of understanding with the post-war Russia, in which sort of connections and neighbor relationship can be maintained. And
I
that's
would
the
make the
difference
same
to
point
the
about
US.
China, in the sense that, I mean, this trip to Beijing by Blinken is important, but the default position in Washington is, I'm tougher on China than you are. No, I'm tougher than you are. And Republicans and Democrats duel with each other to stand up to the existential threat posed by China. And I think, frankly, that many Europeans have a more realistic view. The German national security strategy that came out recently called China a necessary partner. That may be a little bit too forward-leaning for me, but I think one of the roles that Europe can play here is to say to Washington, cool it. Be careful where we head with China. We can't afford an irreparable geopolitical rupture. That's, I think, a refrain that Europeans should be making to Washington at a time when domestic politics here in the United States are pushing Washington towards confrontational policies.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, with Russia, we have a geographical neighborhood point to take into account. With China, we have a very dense economic relationship, which for Europe is important.
Yeah.
So that's a very good point. That's something Europe has to bring into the whole dilemma. Charles, we've come almost to the end of our hour. It was a pleasure talking to you. We will have to keep up all our efforts, I think,
Yes.
to maintain some kind of diplomatic leverage in these uncertain times. And and otherwise hope for the best. May reason prevail.
Well, thank you so much, Eva, for hosting this conversation. It's